Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to today's Friday Reflections on this Friday, the 5th of August, 2022. I hope everybody is doing well, wherever you're tuning into this from, and looking forward to learning more about Imam Al-Ghazali. I'm still going to be reading through this book, the Book of Knowledge, which is part of the Ihya Ulum by the famous Imam. Imam Al-Ghazali himself should need no introduction, and those of you who have been following these Friday Reflections for the past few weeks will know that I've been reading from this book, and it's discussing about how important learning and the gaining of knowledge is within Islam, the emphasis that Islam places on this. So today I'm going to be continuing from page 23, which is section 2 in this book, and it starts with unpraiseworthy and objectionable branches of knowledge, their classifications and the rules which govern them, including those branches of knowledge whose acquisition is deemed fard'ayn, i.e. it's obligatory, as well as those whose acquisition is deemed fard kafiyya, on determining the position of theology and jurisprudence in relation to the science of religion, and finally on showing the superiority of the science of the hereafter. So the title of this section is On Knowledge Whose Acquisition is Deemed Fard'ayn. The Apostle of God, Prophet Muhammad said, seeking knowledge is an ordinance obligatory upon every Muslim. Seeking knowledge is an ordinance obligatory upon every Muslim. This is a very important hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, and it follows on directly from the very first revelation in Quran. Ikra, 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 which means read. Read in the name of your Lord, who taught men by the use of the pen that which they did not know. It follows on from that. Very important hadith. Seeking knowledge is a religious duty upon us as Muslims. Now, obviously, Muslims will vary in their individual capabilities and capacities as to how much they can learn, and also, different lifestyles and other factors that play upon people's lives. But as far as is humanly possible in your circumstances, gaining knowledge is obligatory upon you. You must do your best to learn, at least what you can. And again, seek you knowledge even as far as China. People, however, disagreed as to what branch of knowledge man is obliged to acquire, and as a result, split up into 20 groups. We shall not go into details, but simply summarize the matter by saying that each group insisted on the necessity of acquiring that branch of knowledge which happened to be its speciality. So people, they separate into different groups and they disagreed on what types of knowledge are most important. Nonetheless, they all agreed on the importance of gaining knowledge. The scholastic theologians insisted on scholastic theology because the unity of God, as well as his essence and attributes, is known through it. The jurists held out for jurisprudence because the acts of worship, the lawful, the halal, and the unlawful, the haram, as well as the forbidden and the permissible in daily conduct, are determined through it. Or in other words, what the ordinary man needs in his everyday life, rather than under unusual conditions, is determined through it, i.e. jurisprudence. Furthermore, the commentators and traditionalists holding that through it all sciences are attained, stood for the science of the Quran and its tradition. The Sufis pointed to Sufism as a branch of knowledge which was intended, some saying that it is the science whereby the creature, realizing his position in relation to the divine as a mystical experience in communion with God. Other Sufis said that it comprises knowing what sincerity is and what the afflictions of the soul are, as well as being able to distinguish between the followers of God and the followers of Satan. Others again said that it was the esoteric science whose acquisition was required only of the qualified, select few, and accordingly they dismissed the attempted meaning of the word in favor of its esoteric connection. So in Sufism, there's different groups who, some suggested that, let's go back here. Some suggested that it was to do with understanding our position in relation to the divine, in relation to God. And as a result, that gives us a mystical communion with God. Other Sufis said that it comprises knowing what is sincerity and the diseases of the soul, and being able to distinguish between the good and bad people. Others said that it was an esoterical science. So there's some that they think it's only for a select few to pursue the science of Sufism. According to Abu Talib al-Maki, what is meant by the above mentioned tradition is knowledge of the contents of tradition, which embodies the foundations of Islam, referred to in the following words of the Prophet ﷺ: Islam is built upon 5 pillars. Since these 5 pillars are ordinances imposed by God, it is necessary to know how to fulfill them. The student, therefore, should be absolutely certain that knowledge, as we have already shown in the introduction to this book, is divided into the science of practical religion and the science of revelations. The scope of this discussion is confined to the science of practical religion. So you see the different ways of looking at religion, and this is what Imam Al-Ghazali is discussing here. And people specialize in different areas. This largely explains why you have different groups within Islam, and it's also true within other religions. Certain groups are drawn to certain understandings and certain ways of seeing things, which appeal to them, which they feel are more important. And so, aside from sectarianism, which is a bit different, I'll explain in a sec, but aside from sectarianism, which is a bit different, you will naturally get religion going to certain groupings. Now, those groupings might not necessarily be a different sect. They might not see each other as being outside of the religion. Just like if you look at Sunni Islam, for instance, Sunni Islam is made up of many madhab. There are 4 that are well known: the Hanbali, the Hanafi, the Shafi, and the Maliki. But there are actually more than 4. But most of those other ones are quite small. Some of them are more historical than actually practiced today. But either way, Sunni Islam is comprised of 4 madhabs that see each other as Sunni Muslims, but following a different school. Also, Sunni Islam comprises many Sufi tariqats. You've got the Naqshbandis, the Qadiris, the Chistis, the Alawis, so many different Sufi tariqas. But those Sufi tariqas within Sunni Islam also see each other as being Sunni Muslims. So it's not necessarily that people are belonging to a different sect and seeing the other sect as being outside of Islam. Sunni Islam is really a lot of different groups, but they share certain common beliefs. So they see each other as Muslims and also as Sunni Muslims. But nonetheless, they have focused on certain areas of study and development as far as the religion is concerned. That is quite natural and quite human. And this is what Imam Al-Ghazali was highlighting here. But all of them place emphasis on the gaining of knowledge. This is something which is universally understood by all Muslims, Sunni and Shia and Salafist, as being very, very vitally important even to Islam. Imam Ghazali says here he's focusing on the science of practical religion, although you've also got the science of revelations. The tenets of practical religion, which an adult and sane creature is obliged to observe, deal with three things: beliefs, works, and prohibitions. For example, when a sane individual attains puberty and comes of age, his first obligation is learning the two words of the confession of faith, al-shahada, and understanding their meaning. These two words are, I suppose you could say it's two phrases, but it's being called two words here. These two words are, there is no God but Allah, la ilaha illallah, and Muhammad is the prophet of God, and Muhammad Rasulullah. He is not required to fully penetrate their significance through scrutiny, investigation, and research, but only to believe and confess them unequivocally without the least doubt or hesitation. The latter is obtained by merely accepting on the authority without any investigation or proof, since the prophets required only mere acceptance and confession from the ruffians among the Arabs, without their learning any evidence. Thus, in accepting and confessing the two words, the person fulfills an obligation which is binding at that time. Accordingly, at that time, the branch of knowledge, whose acquisition is divinely ordained and binding for every Muslim, would consist in the learning and understanding of the two words of the confession of faith. Furthermore, at that stage, it is sufficient for them. So you see, Imam Al-Ghazali here is highlighting that when a person comes into Islam, whether through coming from childhood through to puberty to becoming a young adult, or whether through accepting Islam as someone from outside of the community, the important piece of knowledge that they have to focus on in order to do that is the Shahada, the declaration of faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said that merely stating that with sincerity is enough for it to be accepted, because the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, amongst the uneducated Arabs, accepted that from them, even if they didn't fully understand all the implications and the depth of it, which only someone who has studied would really understand. However, upon declaring the Shahada, it is an obligation upon the person who has declared the Shahada to understand what it means, to study it. Imam Al-Ghazali here is saying that at that particular stage of their coming into Islam, a level of understanding, that is enough to study and understand the Shahada, understand what it means that there is only one God, and understand that the Prophet Muhammad is the Prophet of Allah. And that is binding upon every Muslim to do that until such time as they understand what that means. And he said that is sufficient for them at that stage. Because I mean, if you don't even understand that, how can you focus on other things? I remember some years ago when I was teaching the 5 pillars of Islam to some young students who were actually my friend's children. I realized they all knew how to make wudu, even how to pray, but they didn't understand the kalama shahada, which is actually more important than, yes, it's actually more important than wudu and prayer, because it's the basis of it. If you don't understand the kalama shahada, you don't have faith in it, then what are you doing wudu for? What are you praying for? That is built upon the understanding of the kalama shahada. So really, they should have been taught this first, even though they'd been attending madrasa. And I spent a few lessons on it, explaining to them what the kalama shahada means. I broke it down about the belief in God, the understanding of the oneness of God, and like this, and then explain what prophethood means. And when I felt that they were comfortable with that, only then did I move on to wudu and prayers and other details of the deen. Which is what Imam Al-Ghazali is saying in this book, in his own way. He continues and says, after he said it's sufficient for them, this is shown by considering that if a Muslim dies upon accepting and confessing the 2 words of the confession of faith, he would die obedient to God and guilty of no rebellion. Which means that, inshallah, that person will be granted paradise. It's very powerful. I mean, I know Sheikh Hisham Kabani has discussed the importance of the Shahada and how powerful it is. And really, it is central to everything. Really, we don't understand such a gift, what the gift of the Shahada is for the Muslims and for humanity. The person can declare this as long as they do so free from compulsion and with sincerity. They are a Muslim and they are tremendously blessed by Allah. Then Imam Al-Ghazali says, with the rise of new development, however, there would be other obligations, but they would not necessarily be binding upon every individual. On the contrary, it would be quite possible for some to be free from them. That's a very, very important sentence in understanding Islam. With the rise of new development, so as you come to another stage in your life, another stage in your journey of understanding and of faith and spirituality, there would be other obligations. There are other things that you have to do, or you should do at that stage. But they would not necessarily be binding upon everybody. A good example of this that everybody is familiar with is the Imam in the mosque. There are certain things, certain obligations which the Imam has while he is in that role, which he has to do, but which the people that are lined up and praying behind him don't have to worry about. Because he is the Imam, he is the one leading the prayer. He is the shepherd of the flock. So while he is in that role, he has more responsibility than the people praying behind him. Similarly, a mother or father in relation to their children obviously has more responsibility than their children. Even if their children get to the age of 18 and become young adults, the parents still have more responsibility than someone who has just turned 18, even though before the law, they are both considered adults. Similarly, for every Muslim, depending on who they are, their level of understanding, what their role is within the community or society at large, there are different obligations upon different Muslims. Just because one Muslim is doing this and another Muslim is not doing that, doesn't mean that either of them is better or worse a Muslim than the other one, because they have different roles and different responsibilities. Continuing on this line, Imam Al-Ghazali says, the new developments may affect obligations regarding works or prohibitions or beliefs. Regarding works, for example, if a person's life were to extend from dawn until noon, he would be required to learn how to perform his ablutions and to pray because of the approaching noon hour. In such a case, it would be wrong to say that it is obvious that he should persist in his study, and if he finds that his life will extend beyond noon and thinks that he might not be able to finish it in time, he should still persist and perform his ablutions and pray before evening. However long this may be after the appointed hour, in short, he should give study primary consideration regardless of the time required. In addition, it is said that the obligation to acquire knowledge, which is the prerequisite for works, is derived from the obligation to perform works, in which case it might not even be obligatory before sunset. This is true of the other prayers. So Imam Al-Ghazali here is saying that the person should give study primary consideration, even before prayer. It's a powerful point, and not one that I generally hear amongst a lot of Muslims. Further, should a person live until the beginning of Ramadan, he would be obliged to learn all about fasting, i.e. that lasts from morning until sunset, that observing it requires resolve, abstinence from food, drink, and sexual intercourse, as well as seeing the new moon personally, or accepting the word of 2 eyewitnesses instead. Similarly, should a person come into some wealth, or on the coming of age, inherit some, he should learn all about zakah. For although fulfilling the obligation is not immediately incumbent upon him, it would become so at the end of the first year, after his acceptance of Islam. Should he possess nothing but camels, he would not need to learn the zakah of sheep, and the same is true of the other varieties of wealth. When, however, the months of pilgrimage begin, it will not be necessary for a person to start at once to learn how to make the Hajj. And since it is performed at leisure, learning how to do it is not immediately obligatory. Rather, the learned men of Islam should point out to him that the pilgrimage is a divine ordinance to be observed at leisure and convenience by everyone who, as a man of means, has both the provisions and the means of transportation. In other words, this is something which only if you have the means to do it, it becomes incumbent upon you. But the people of knowledge within the community should point out to you that should you come into the means and be able to afford it, then you should do it. This should be done in the hope of inducing the individual himself to resolve upon the pilgrimage. Should he so resolve, it would become necessary for him to learn how the pilgrimage is performed. He would not need, however, to learn anything except its essentials and duties, and not the voluntary acts of supererogation connected with it. For if performing the voluntary acts is supererogatory, its knowledge also be, and learning it consequently would not be a divine ordinance binding on all Muslims. In other words, I mean, this is a very complicated way of doing it, but I mean, it's English that's being used here. But basically, there are certain things which you're supposed to do when you go on Hajj. He would only need, or she, whoever is the new Muslim, whether through age and they come of age into a young adult, or whether they come into Islam from outside the community, when they decide to embark upon the Hajj, they would not need to know every possible thing that you can do on the Hajj. They would only need to know the important rituals which everybody has to do. Any extra things, they don't have to know, but obviously, if they learn them, there's blessing in doing so. But no one should be putting pressure on them about that, nor should they feel that they're missing something if they don't know, because they're still new. And Imam Al-Ghazali says the same reasoning applies to the knowledge of the other works which are divinely ordained and binding upon all Muslims. In other words, just as this applies to the Hajj, this principle applies to everything. The important thing is to know what is fard, what is essential. As long as you know and you fulfill that, you're not doing anything wrong. And there is blessing in that too. But at the same time, if you can learn in more depth and learn other things which you may want to do within the tradition which have barakah, blessings, then if you learn them, it's good. But you shouldn't be feeling under any pressure to learn stuff that is additional. Especially if you're still learning the basics. That said, you should have the intention to want to learn and to want to deepen your knowledge. But at the same time, if you don't have that much time in your day, you have a busy 9 to 5 job, you have a family, or whatever your situation is, something like this, you may not have that much time to be able to devote. But you should do your best to make time to study these things as far as is humanly possible. But if you're already doing that, you shouldn't be beating yourself up about not knowing absolutely everything, because to be fair, no one knows absolutely everything. And especially in this day and age, when we have so many pressures upon our lives, and in the next few years, that's likely to only increase because of the situation in the world. Imam Al-Ghazali continues and says, as to prohibitions, the acquisition of the knowledge of which is obligatory, the obligation is conditioned by the wise of new developments and changed circumstances relevant to it, and varies with the condition of the individual. Now, if someone had told me this when I embraced Islam 22 years ago, the obligations on us as Muslims vary with the condition of the individual. You have to treat every Muslim as an individual, and that's whether they are a traditional Muslim from a traditional Muslim family, or whether they are a convert like myself. Because it's also true, if you look at young Muslims, they don't know a huge amount, and they have all sorts of pressures on them, especially in a society where Islam is a minority religion and not part of the general culture of the society. They have all sorts of pressures on them. So you can't be harsh on them. You have to take each one as an individual and encourage them towards what Islam teaches. So hopefully they can get some benefit from it, but don't expect them to be doing everything. And if you push too hard, you might end up pushing them out of Islam, which is surely not what anybody wants, either of our young Muslims or of converts. And I suspect in today's world, this also applies to a lot of people in traditionally Muslim countries as well. Because the pressures of life everywhere are such that life has got very tough for a lot of people. Imam Al-Ghazali continues and says, the mute is not obliged to know what is lawful in speech, nor the blind to know what things are unlawful to see. So pardon Allah, there's a lot of wisdom in that. There's no point telling a blind person not to look at things which are haram to look at, because I'll never see them anyway. What's the point? Unless they become a scholar and they're learning it in order to pass that knowledge on to other people. But even then, they wouldn't actually fully necessarily understand if they'd always been blind from birth. Similarly, the Bedouin is not obliged to know the houses in which it is unlawful to sit. All these obligations only apply within the limits of circumstance and need not be learned when it is uncertain that the question of their applicability will not arise. But whatever situation resemble these and may therefore be confused with them must be distinguished from them, as, for example, the case for an individual who, at the time of his embracing Islam, was in the habit of wearing silk garments or possessed something illegally. Or looked at a woman whom he could not legally marry. In such a case, he could be warned. On the other hand, whatever does not resemble these things and is therefore not confusing to which one may be exposed through contact, such as food and drink, instruction concerning it is obligatory. Hence, if an individual happens to be in a town where it is customary to drink wine and eat pork, it is imperative that he be taught concerning their prohibition and warned against using them. Moreover, of all things in which instruction is obligatory, acquiring a knowledge of them is also obligatory. So it is a whole set of considerations here as to what is important for a person to learn. I mean, for instance, You don't have to over worry about teaching people about how haram wine or pork is and really putting an emphasis on that if they live in the middle of Saudi Arabia in a town where there is never any pork or wine in that town whatsoever. I mean, at some point they should learn, but it's not that important as it would be in a society like the one in which I live, where it is everywhere. And similarly, if someone just come into Islam and they have silk shirts, I mean, you don't make too much of a fuss about it because, alhamdulillah, they've come into Islam. This is more important. And also, even with silk clothes, I mean, it's not discussed here, but there are actually dispensations for people, such as with sensitive skin or other skin conditions, that they are actually allowed to wear them. A man is allowed to wear a silk shirt if he has sensitive skin or some similar skin condition, which means that if he wore another kind of cloth, it would make his skin sore or give him a rash or something. In such cases, he is allowed to wear silk. Whereas traditionally, aside from these dispensations, a man shouldn't be wearing silk. But of course, I mean, we live in 2022, and how many people wear silk shirts? Most people today will wear cotton or polyester shirts or a mixture. So it's not really so relevant as it once would have been. The most silk that people might wear, that most people might wear today, is probably a silk tie, which, it's even arguable that that might be acceptable because it's only a small piece of material for decoration. It's not a whole shirt. People are allowed within the most traditional interpretations of jurisprudence to have a small amount of silk embroidery decoration on a shirt made of another material, and it doesn't make it haram for them to wear it. You see, these matters only come about with understanding. People they like make these blanket statements without considering the circumstances. And Imam Al-Ghazali here is saying circumstances, everything. You have to understand the circumstances and the condition of the individual. And only then can you apply what is important for them to learn. And of course, this is where having a good sheikh is vitally important, a good teacher who can explain to you, who understands Islam and also understands your culture, your society, your condition. Only such a person can explain to you what is appropriate for you to learn, what is best in your situation. Someone who comes from elsewhere in the world, even though they may be eminently qualified as a scholar, they might not be able to advise you because they're unfamiliar with your circumstances or your society or other cultural issues. They'd have to first familiarize themselves with those before they can appropriately advise you. As to the beliefs and actions of the heart, knowledge of them is obligatory according to the state of the mind. Thus, if one should feel any passing thought of doubt as to the two words of the confession of faith means, it would be obligatory upon him to acquire the knowledge of whatever would remove that doubt. If, on the other hand, he felt no such passing thought, but died before believing that the word of God, the Quran, is eternal, visible, and not a substratum for originated properties, as well as other often repeated article of faith, he would have still died a professing Muslim. These feelings of feelings of doubt, which render the knowledge of the articles of faith obligatory, arise in the mind either naturally or as a result of hearing things in one's own community. Thus, in a time where rumors have spread and the people talk heresy, the individual should, in the early years of his maturity, be protected against such influence by being instructed in the elements of truth. Oh my goodness, subhanAllah. Do you know, I've been saying this for the past 20 odd years since I embraced Islam. And now I'm reading it in Al-Ghazali's Ihya al-Madin, and I came to this conclusion myself through my own reflection. You know, I used to say to people, what's important with all this craziness going on in the world at the moment, and people not understanding what Islam is, it's important that we teach young people the basics of Islam in plain English, or whatever the language of the state is if it's another country, so that they understand the basic principles of Islam. And that becomes like an inoculation, you know, just like you get a vaccination against measles, mumps, and rubella. It becomes a vaccination against extremism or against heresy and other kinds of crazy ideas. Because you understand the basics of your religion in your own mother tongue. Yeah, here in the UK, it's not uncommon. It's become less prevalent today, but certainly when I came into Islam 22 years ago, it was not uncommon to go to classes in a mosque that were being taught in Urdu or Bengali or some of the language from another country. The young British children in that mosque, or part-time madrasa in the mosque, that they didn't understand properly, because essentially they were British. Their first language was English, even if their parents' first language was something else. So they barely understood what was going on and what they're being taught. And often they were being taught a syllabus that was imported from elsewhere. I'm not saying it may or may not be relevant somewhere else in the world, but it certainly wasn't relevant in the middle of Birmingham or Manchester. People just imported the way they were doing things from somewhere else and were not teaching the basics of Islam in the way that children could understand, and in a way which, you know, would appeal to them, that the knowledge would actually sink in. Even if some of these points were mentioned amongst lots of other stuff that was less relevant. And this is exactly what Imam Al-Ghazali is saying here. The individual should, in the early years of his maturity, be protected against such influence by being instructed in the elements of truth. What this means is the basics of Islam. Wallahi. If, on the other hand, he were exposed to falsehood, it would become necessary to remove it from his heart, a task which might prove difficult. Again, if this particular Muslim were a merchant living in the midst of a town where the practice of usury was prevalent, it would be obligatory to warn him against usury. This, then, is the truth concerning the knowledge whose acquisition is deemed an ordinance of God binding on everyone, and no less binding on some because of its observance by others. The gist of all this is knowledge of how to perform works whose discharge is obligatory. Whoever, therefore, knows what works are obligatory, together with the time of their discharge, the same possesses the knowledge whose acquisition is fard'ayn. So, I mean, it's important that at first people learn what is obligatory in Islam. And if people haven't completed their understanding of what's obligatory, there's no point telling them about some nawafil practice that is not essential. So they don't even understand and practice what's obligatory. Furthermore, what the Sufis hold relative to the understanding of the thoughts of the enemy and those of the company of heaven is also true, although only those who apply themselves to it, although only to those who apply themselves to it. If, however, man does not, for the most part, refrain from the impulses of evil, hypocrisy, and envy, he should seek to acquire whatever knowledge he may feel he needs from the quarter on the destructive matters of life. How can he neglect this obligation when the Apostle of God said, Salam, 3 things in life are destructive: sordid avarice, vehement passion, and self-conceit. And no man can refrain from these. The rest of what we shall mention of the reprehensible conditions of the heart, such as pride, conceit, etc., all follow from these 3 aforementioned destructive matters of life. Their eradication is a fard'ayn. It is, however, not possible except through a knowledge of the nature of these destructive matters of life, as well as their causes, symptoms, and cures, as he who knows not evil falls into it. You see, you actually have to know about evil in order to avoid it. Because how can you avoid what you don't know is danger? It's like even a child, you warn them, do not put your hand into the fire. It'll burn you. Do not touch the kettle for the same reason. Do not walk too close to the edge of the cliff. How is a child going to know that that is going to burn him, or falling off the cliff is dangerous, until such a point that he realizes that he's either being told or he sees something that makes him realize? Similarly, if we don't know about evil and the dangers of evil, and what's evil and why it's evil, then how are we going to avoid it? It's important. It's important to understand that. A cure is, in reality, confronting a cause with its opposite. How could such a thing be possible without a knowledge of both cause and effect? Most of the things we have mentioned in the quarter on the destructive matters of life belong to the fard'ayn class, which have been totally neglected by people in favor of pursuing things which do not matter. And this was written how long ago? SubhanAllah. How some things change and some things don't. Among the things about which we should proceed to inform the individual, in case they have not been transmitted from one person to another, are belief in paradise, hell, the day of resurrection, and the day of judgment, in order that he may believe and accept them, as they are the continuation of the words of the confession of faith. This is required because after the acceptance of Muhammad's prophethood, the message which he conveyed, namely that whoever should obey God and his apostle would enter paradise, and whoever should disobey them would enter hellfire, should be understood. If, therefore, you would pay attention to this reasoning, you would know that this is the true way of life. You would also find out that every servant suffers in the course of his life, both during the day and the night, from enduring thoughts of doubt, which befall him in the performance of his acts of worship and daily transactions. These thoughts require new obligations, and consequently, it becomes necessary for him to inquire concerning every unusual occurrence which may happen to him, as well as to proceed to learn what may be generally expected to occur in the near future. Finally, if it should become clear that what the Prophet meant by his words, seeking knowledge is an ordinance obligatory upon every Muslim, is knowledge with the definite article, namely the knowledge of only those words which are well known to be obligatory upon every Muslim, this line of reasoning would become apparent, as would also the time in which these obligations should be discharged. God, however, knows best. There's a lot to think about there, a lot to unpack, and I hope you found that beneficial and food for thought. And I think it's incredibly relevant for the times in which we live. And I've seen in the 22 years that I've been a Muslim, lots of things that have been emphasized and taught by various preachers and imams over the years, which are not really that important in the grand scheme of things, or certainly not important at that particular point to the person that they are talking to. Yet, this is what they were emphasizing. And there are other things that they could have been teaching which they neglected to teach that would have been far more important, far more relevant for them to highlight. And one of the things that I've been doing for the past, 10 to 15 years or so, since I've really been going out there and helping people, educating them about Islam. There was a bit before that, but this is the main time that I've been doing that. One of the things that I've been doing is explaining to people basics of Islam. What is important and what is not important, and what you should focus on. And many people have come back into Islam after me explaining these things to them, highlighting to them what is relevant for the Islam, from the Islam for them at their particular stage in life. And then afterwards, you see they build upon this once they stabilize in their understanding, and they see the relevance in Islam for them. It's worth thinking about. I think things have improved a bit since when I first came to Islam, and there's a lot more improvements in the education of young Muslims in mosques and madrasas in this country, and perhaps elsewhere in the world as well. But still, this is an area we need to think about, and something we should give much more attention to. I wish you all the very best, and inshallah I should be back on Monday for my Sufi meditation session, and I wish you all a very wonderful weekend, and if you're in the UK, a very good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and blessings of God be with you all. Good night.